Section 27 of The Mystery of Easter Island, The Story of an Expedition. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Mystery of Easter Island, The Story of an Expedition by Katherine Routledge. San Francisco to Panama, Part 2. The island is said to possess no fresh water. We found no provision made in the cave for conserving a supply. Scrambling through the sagebush, we made for the dry torrent. Here we found one of the channels had been diverted, and in it sunk a well or shaft some 10 feet deep, with fine soil at its bottom. The end of a rope just showed for about 1 foot above the surface of the silt at the bottom of the shaft. Nearby was a rough cradle and makeshift gear for gold washing. They had been here during the rains, and the torrent had supplied the washing water. Thinking of a possible sealed bottle placed in the shaft bucket at the end of the rope, we left 2 hands there with orders to follow the rope carefully down to its termination and see what was on the end of it. The cutter with 2 hands we sent back to the ship. We and 1 hand, a Russian Finn who had been for some years on the Alaska coast, then set off inland to see what the world was like and to get a sheep if possible. By this time, the heat had become very great. The soil, yellow volcanic ash, soaked up the sun's rays and then threw the heat back as would a hot brick. Everything was so dry that we marveled that vegetation could hold its own. We saw no form of grass, but the surface was generally covered with sagebush extending from the level of the knee in general to above one's head in the bottoms. We had scrambled up the ravine from our pirate's cave and up the steep ground around it. We now found ourselves on a well-defined ridge that ran parallel to the sea, with a breeze, though a hot one, in our faces, and a glorious view of sea, coastline, and mountain. Our whales were clearly visible far away in the bight to the westward, whilst to the nor'ard lay the great mass of an unnamed volcano, with its top lost in mists, its sides sweeping downwards with typical curvature till they reached the sea. We gave the mountain the name of Mount Mana. It is 3,707 feet high. Much information about it will appear someday. Between the ridge on which we now stood and the well-defined foot of Mount Mana opposite to us was a valley some half a mile wide. We made our way across this valley as far as the mountain's foot in order to cut across any tracks, human or ovine, that might pass down it, because they would tell us the news, like a file of newspapers, for any movement on the island would pass along this bottom. Here the sagebush was very strong and high, and we found it difficult to get through. It frequently was tunneled where it was thick, reminding one of hippo paths leading to the water. In the present case, however, bits of the fleeces of the makers were clinging to the sides of the tunnel. The only signs of man were the brass shell of an exploded military cartridge and a few heads and horns of sheep lying where the beasts had been shot. Here and there along the course of the valley, masses of black volcanic rock, bare of vegetation, rose above the bright yellow soil and its sagebush covering. The surface of the plain and of the mountain's base were also punctuated by isolated specimens of a species of fig, Ficus cotinifolia, having a dark green fleshy leaf somewhat like that of the magnolia, and a number of separate trunks or stems. These trees, like all else, were dwarf and stunted and about 15 feet high. Every tree formed a flattish roof, as it were, supported on many pillars and impervious to the sun. It was delightful to rest for a short while under each as we came to it for a brief respite from the shimmering heat. Beneath them the ground was bare and smooth. The sheep tracks and tunnels led from tree to tree, and it was evident that the sheep made it their practice to rest on these shady spots during the heat of the day. Whilst so resting ourselves, we were amused and interested by several little birds of different sorts. They chummed up en route and kept close to us wherever we went, flitting from bush to bush, and when we sat down in the shade, sidled along the branches till they got as close to us as they could, short of absolutely alighting upon us. They acted just as native children do toward the white man when they have got over their first shyness. Working upwind, we soon found sheep. They were in small bunches, varying from 3 to perhaps a dozen. We got a couple, though both getting up to the game and the shooting was difficult in such cover, and resolved itself into snapshots as they followed their tracks across the occasional isolated masses of dark basalt that rose above the yellow soil and which supported no vegetation. Having grallocked our victims and slung the carcasses well up onto our shoulders with both breast strap and brow strap, Micmac fashion, we started back for Cruising Club Cove. It was now about noon, and as a direct line seemed feasible, we decided to take that line. The better road along the sheep tracks, and therefore through their tunnels along the bottom of the valley, was impossible for a laden man. We did it! Across the valley, often brought to a standstill by scrub that would not yield when leant against, up the hillside to its delusive gap, often on hands and knees, down the steep pitch on the other side with bump and crash, regardless of scratches, thinking only of how to avoid a broken leg or twisted ankle. Then a final wrestle with scrub in the ravine bottom, and we were on the shore. What a relief to throw up that brow strap for the last time and to let the mutton fall, with a thump, on the stones. Then off with what remained of our clothes, with which we draped the bushes to dry, and into the tepid shallow water, shallow for fear of sharks. Orders were given that whilst bathing, a good fire of scrub wood should be made on a spot sheltered from the sun by the side of a lofty rock. On that fire's glowing cinders, when nearly burnt out, we presently grilled kidneys of peculiar excellence, and boiled the billy, and thanked the immortal gods. The examination of the dry shaft, which was the job of the 2 hands left behind, was never made. They reported that soon after beginning work the side of the shaft fell in. On looking at it, it was clear that we could not now do anything there. So we hunted around again, collecting seeds and plants and rock samples. Presently, amongst the drift material at storm-high water mark, we came across a cube of wood, 12 or 15 inches square, the end of a baulk of timber sawn off. Through it was bored an auger hole and a rope rove. The end of the rope passed through the block was finished with a stopper knot, a knot known only to seamen. Its other end had one long single strand that had been broken. The other 2 strands were shorter than the first by some 2 feet. They had been cut through. The story was clear. We only wanted a name, and, mirabile dictu, we have it. Turning over the block, on one face is deeply cut in letters some 3 inches long the words, Annie Larson, Pussy is out of the bag. For the benefit of those who are not shippy, yachty devils, we will now explain. When you drop your anchor at any spot where the nature of the bottom is such that you may, perhaps, not be able to lift it again by heaving on the chain in the ordinary way, because the anchor has fallen amongst rocks or into some mermaid's coral cave, under such circumstances, it is customary to fasten one end of a rope to the end of the anchor opposite to that to which the chain is attached, that is, to the crown, and to the other end of the rope you make fast a buoy. You buoy your anchor. Then, when the sour moment comes to take a heave, and you have heaved in vain, you pick up your anchor buoy and haul on its rope, and up comes your anchor without a struggle, like Cleopatra's red herring. Our find told us that it belonged to a ship of moderate size, for her anchor was of moderate weight because the anchor rope was of moderate strength, and that ship was probably a sailing ship because she had no steam winch, for steamers don't usually buoy, having immense steam heaving power. She had not intentionally left it. The rope had had 2 strands cut through by the sharp rocks of the bottom, then the 3rd strand had torn apart from strain, and the buoy, with its short length of rope, drifted away to be ultimately thrown up above ordinary high water mark during a gale. Like the Duck, it might have come down from San Francisco. Not so. The 2 cut strands had not been long in the water after they had been cut before they were thrown up high and dry. It was very compromising for Annie. Of course, we immediately asked, "Anyone know the Annie Larson?" The Russian Finn, naturally au courant with all the coast scandal after a month in San Francisco, was immediately able to inform us that the Annie Larson was an American schooner of about 300 tons and was in the Mexican gun-running line till captured so laden by a USA ship of war only a month ago whilst we were at San Francisco. So we had got to the bottom of things after all, though we had failed to find the post office. Socorro Island was the depot for the late Yankee gun runner Annie Larson. The special little-used boat was for shipping, not for landing the stuff. The Mexicans had come and fetched it away in their own craft as they got the chance. Some of the Annie Larson crowd, being old Alaska hands, had prospected the ravine for gold, Alaska fashion. It was not a case of shipwrecked men on a waterless island. The afternoon was now getting late. Mana stood boldly in close to the entrance of the cove. She lowered her cutter, the shore party were soon on board again, and at 5:35 p.m., February 6, 1916, we bore away for Icaron Island at the entrance to the Gulf of Panama, south 69 degrees east, distant 1,834 miles. As we watched the island fade in the dusk, we thought we had done with Socorro forever, but it was not thus written. Some 6 months after our visit, a man was arrested at Singapore as a spy and there detained in prison. That man was the writer of the message in the bottle. In prison, he chanced to get hold of a piece of local newspaper, and that particular number happened to have in it an account of the voyage of Mana taken from the London papers. It incidentally mentioned that she had touched at Socorro. A ship, then, had been to his island. What had we found? How much did we know? Had we found the post office? On release, he made his way to England to find out. But now is not the time to tell the story. We are bound for Panama, or for Cape Horn, for better or for worse, for heat or for cold. Chance, however, at this time, all unknown to us, had decided our fate. The rainy season was now approaching, and we even got an occasional warning shower, which made us all the more anxious to reach the isthmus and get clear of it before its unhealthy season set in. But our progress was slow. We could not run the main engine continuously, as we only had a small supply of lubricating oil adapted to the great heat. That with which we had been supplied at San Francisco proved useless. Also, we had long before unwisely sent back to England the light canvas and all its gear in order to get more stowage room. In doing so, we thought we would be able to run the ship under power in light airs, and therefore would not want it. 'Twas an error. However, we always made something, for if she did not do her 50 miles in the 24 hours, we unmuzzled the motor. Our engineer, Eduardo Silva of Talcahuano, a Chilean, was a most excellent young fellow, always keen and willing, always grooming his 3 charges, the engines of the yacht, the lifeboat, and the electric light, and ever ready to run them despite the terrible heat in the engine room. Sometimes, when the big 38 horsepower motor had a fit of the tantrums, because it could not get cold water from the sea quickly enough to assuage its body heat, and he durst not leave it, he would eventually appear on deck as pale as a sheet and completely done. On one such occasion he reflectively remarked, as the two of us looked down into the engine room from the deck, "Al same casa del diablo." He did not exaggerate. Day followed day. We gradually gnawed into our 1,834 miles. The Russian Finn came to the fore as a keen sportsman. From tea time to dusk he was generally to be found somewhere outside the vessel's bows, sometimes on the bowsprit end, sometimes standing on the bobstay, regardless of the fact that a shark was very frequently in attendance on us in the eddy water under our counter. Looking over the taffrail, you could see the brute weaving from side to side, as does a plum-pudding carriage dog at his horse's heels. One experienced a sort of fascination in watching these great fish at night, their every movement displayed by the luminosity of the water, until they themselves, on occasion, seemed to glow with a phosphoric light. Mana in these waters generally had shoals or companies of small fish in attendance on her, amongst which were always a few larger ones. We got to know individuals by sight. We thought they kept to her for protection. It certainly was not for what they could get off her copper. With that we never had any trouble. It kept as bright as gold. One night we were asleep on the locker in the deckhouse companion and were awakened by an unholy struggle and crash. Nipping out, we found the Russian on lookout forward, regardless of the sleepers below him, and had leant over her bows and had actually hoiked out with a gaff hook a large porpoise. It seemed impossible to believe that a man could have had the physical strength to hoist such a mass bodily out of the water, up her high bow and over the rail. He seemed to have fairly lifted it out by the scruff of its neck as it rushed alongside after the fish. He only fell overboard once. That was on the voyage from the Sandwich Islands when we were not aboard. On reaching San Francisco, he brought a note from Mr. Gillam to us at our hotel to report arrival. We, of course, inquired as to their voyage. The Russian said it had been quite the usual thing. Nothing had happened out of the common. Long afterwards, he casually informed us that on that run, when he went forward one night from the quarter-deck to the galley to make the coffee for the change of watch at midnight, he went first to do some job on the top-gallant forecastle head and got knocked overboard. En route to the land of Never Never, he found the weather jib sheet in his hand, and by it was able to haul himself aboard again. As he was supposed to be in the galley, he would never have been expected to show for half an hour, and therefore would not have been missed until the watch mustered. It did not seem to occur to him that he had had a bit of a squeak. He did not get wet, so nobody knew, for he told no one. As an angel, perhaps there was a certain amount of black down underneath his white plumage, but as an A.B., one wished for no better. He was the second of Mana's company to be killed by the Huns after our return. After heaving to like this, to let the reader into some of the little humors of our domestic life, we must get under way again. Well, everybody seemed quite happy and contented on this 'ere run. Fish, birds, weird ocean currents and their slack water areas with accumulated drift, sail mending, turning out and painting the forecastle with life on deck instead of below for a few days, a threatened blow that never reached us, but only sent along its swell to justify the actions of the glass, and the ever-varying incidents associated with life on a small craft in unfrequented tropical seas, for we never saw another sail, made us so forgetful of the flight of time that it seemed that we had but left Socorro before we found ourselves off Icaron Island, our prearranged landfall. 31 days had faded away like a dream. Now close to the island of Icaron lies another one much larger. We had a plan of it, Koiba or Kibo Island. The sailing directions said, "Turtles abound, but they are hard to catch." We didn't want any more turtle. Crabs, cockles, and oysters are plentiful. In the woods, monkeys and parrots abound, and in Anson's time, 1741, there were deer, but the interior is nearly inaccessible from the steepness of the cliffs and the tangled vegetation. Explorers should beware of alligators and snakes. The chart showed an excellent anchorage and indicated fresh water. It seemed promising. We would see what it was like. We were particularly desirous of now making good our expenditure of water, as we did not know what were the conditions we might find prevailing at Panama, both as regards its quality and the facilities for getting it. We had sighted Icaron Island at daylight on Monday, the 6th of March, 1916, but calms, baffling airs, and currents prevented our making our proposed anchorage by daylight. At dusk, therefore, we hove to for the night. Festina lentiter was ever our motto. We had the most recent chart, certainly, but its last correction was in 1865, and coral patches grow quickly. Not until noon next day did we get abreast of Nagata Point, the southeast extremity of Kibo Island. As the coast was charted free from dangers, we came fairly close in, and starting the motor about 1 o'clock, ran along the shore under power, with a lookout in the foretop. It was very interesting and pleasant, after a month at sea, thus to coast along the fringe of a tropical island, sweeping round rocky points of the land and peeping into lovely little coves fringed with white coral sand that merged into a dense tropical vegetation, with hills in the background. It soon becomes instinctive to keep the sharpest of lookouts ahead, that is, into the clear water, for a change of color indicating danger, and yet to see everything around. The most memorable feature of this particular afternoon was the large number of devilfish that were seen springing into the air. As many as 3 or 4 might be observed within as many minutes. Suddenly, near or far, a large object, like a white painted notice board, shot vertically into the air to considerable height, to fall back again on its flat with resounding spank and high-flying spray, leaving a patch of milky foam on the smooth blue surface of the water. In British seas, this family of fishes is represented by the skate. Here they attain the dimensions of a fair-sized room. A specimen in the British Museum from Jamaica measures 15 feet by 15 feet and is between 3 and 4 feet thick. Hence, the statement that their capture is uncertain and sometimes attended with danger is probably not far from correct. Perched aloft, and thus having a large and unobstructed horizon, we saw one jump probably every 10 minutes throughout the afternoon. The motor brought us to our anchorage, and at 5 o'clock we let go in 9 fathoms, sand and mud, the shore distant about 1.5 miles. We had seen hitherto no sign of the island being occupied, nor did we now. After dark, however, at 2 widely separated points, a fire blazed up and lights showed for a short while. Smoking on deck, when dinner was finished, we speculated as to the meaning of the different mysterious grunts and gurgles, sighs and plunges that stole over the tepid, oily water. The tropical sea after dark seemed to have voices as many and varied as the tropical forest has when the sun is gone. From 6 p.m. onward, the thermometer read 87 degrees Fahrenheit. At 6 a.m., it had fallen to 83 degrees, the cool of the morning. With the daylight, a single pirogue, with 2 men in her, came alongside. She was a small and roughly made dugout, very leaky. In the wet of her bottom lay a bunch of bananas, perched on which were a couple of large macaws. Each of these had a strip of bark some 2 feet long tied to its leg. The bunch of bananas lay like an island above the water in her. Onto it, as a refuge, the parrots crawled. Their jesses entangled amongst the bananas, the boat rolled, so did the banana bunch. Each bird would climb upward, but he could not. The accursed thong held him down. He was being crushed, he was being drowned, he and his mate, and each said so. An American mining captain taking up his parable was not in it with those birds for language. The two men were negroid in feature. One of them had only one leg and seemed sad and ill. The other was more cheerful. We could get along together in Spanish. They invited us to come ashore. Hoisting out the cutter, we followed them in. Their lead was useful as the water is so shoal. Though the rise and fall is but small feet, yet a large area of coral rock flats is dry at low water on either side of the boat channel. At the entrance to this channel, an open sailing boat, some 25 feet long, their property, lay at anchor. As the tide was falling, we thought it best to leave our cutter at anchor in sufficiently deep water for her not to take the ground, and got our friends to ferry us from her, one by one, into shoal water in their canoe. It was most comic to see some of our big chaps kneeling on the bottom of the crazy little craft with a hand on either gunwale, whilst they bent forward like devout Mussulmans on their carpets, endeavoring to get their center of gravity as low as possible. We were the last of the passengers. When the water got to be only knee-deep, the native anchored his canoe and we stepped overboard. So did our one-legged ferryman. His right hand controlled a crutch. In his left he held various treasures obtained from Mana. He also desired to take his two big parrots ashore, so, as the last item of all, he hooked his finger under the cord that tied them together, thus carrying them swinging heads downward. But apparently he had not taken the cord fairly in the middle. One parrot was suspended by a short length of line, the other by a long. He of the short cord was able to twist himself round and get a hold with his beak on some package in his owner's hand, and was thus reasonably happy. But parrots, like ourselves, can't have it all ways in this world of woe. If his head be up, his tail must be down, hence this tale. He of the long string found himself draggling in the water with every stride of his one-legged owner. In his struggles to avoid drowning by a succession of dips, he managed at last to grasp, with beak and claw, the long dependent tail of his fellow prisoner, and quickly hauling himself up it, he at once proceeded to consolidate his position by seizing in his beak the softest part of his colleague's hinder anatomy with the vice-like grip of despair, and therefrom he continued to depend in placid comfort, regardless of the other's piercing shrieks and protestations. It is not always those at the top of the ladder that have the best time of it. A wide shoreline of white sand met us. On it, at high water mark, were large quantities of white bleached driftwood trees. On the flat ground behind, beneath a dense tree growth, were some small pools of stagnant rainwater. A few coconut palms were dotted about, all else was jungle. On a patch cleared of undergrowth stood a light frame structure open on all sides. The roof was high-pitched and had wide eaves. There was no attempt at a floor. It might be 30 feet by 20 feet. Smaller, similar structures adjoined for cooking and stores. A box or two, baskets, hammocks, and a little boat gear were suspended from the beams above. A few wooden blocks for stools were on the earthen floor, which was neatly swept. On one such sat a terribly afflicted specimen of humanity, the mother, yet nevertheless dignified and courteous. The father, a spare little man with an intelligent face, lay in his hammock and extended his hand feebly over the side, simply saying that he was infirma. He seemed to avoid making any movement. 4 or 5 children of various ages moved listlessly about. Only one of them, a girl of 10 or 12 years of age, seemed quite healthy. Then there was the one sound man from the pirogue and the cripple. The whole family were being slowly destroyed by fever and elephantiasis, and apparently must, before long, perish from lack of ability to gather food. No resources were visible, though no doubt they had a little cultivated ground somewhere handy, and of course there was always fish. The whole story of gradually encroaching disease and suffering was so easy to read, and the patient and hopeless resignation with which the little group awaited its predestined extinction was very pathetic. They uttered no complaint, nor asked for anything. We made the best of things, and got them quite cheerful and interested, producing from time to time various trifles from our pockets, which we generally carried with us as presents when going ashore. Anxious to please, they gave us various quaint shells and a little fruit, and again pressed on our acceptance the hapless macaws, now secured to a handy branch, whose bedraggled plumage and sorry mien seemed quite in keeping with the surroundings. Altogether, our visit seemed to give our hosts pleasure. The man appeared to have some Spanish blood in him and to have known better days. We then returned to the ship and had breakfast, sending back by the pirogue, which had returned with us, a little present of ship's biscuit, tinned meat, cigarettes, and quinine. It was obvious that no watering was feasible at this landing place. They told us we should be able to get water at the other spot where we had seen a light the evening before. Pulling, in the heat and sun, any considerable distance was out of the question, so we hoisted out the motor lifeboat launch, taking the cutter in tow for landing. We found another wide sandy beach, but with fairly deep water right up to it. There was sufficient breaking swell on it to require the cutter to be hauled up smartly, directly her nose touched, or the next sea would have knocked her broadside on and filled her. The shore was bordered by what appeared to us, from its state of neglect, to be a deserted coconut plantation. We, however, told the men not to swarm up for nuts for the present. There are generally some low, easily climbed trees, until we found out how the land lay. The white man never seems to be able to understand that petty plundering of native plantations is a bad introduction. Needless to say that it was not many minutes before the irrepressible Finn had found on the ground a bunch of green nuts and was devouring them with the avidity of a land crab. Footprints on the shore and trails through the scrub soon brought us to a group of shanties under the palm trees and therefore close to the shoreline. The coconut palm seems to thrive best just beyond high water mark, and on any flat at about that level behind the furthest point reached by the water. Trees are often to be seen with the soil round their roots partially washed away on one side of the trunk. A white man came walking along the shore to meet us. Of course, the first thing we did was to apologize for the unseemly sight of the men all feeding on his nuts. He was fairly cordial, but evidently greatly perplexed as to who and what we were. We told him as well as we could about the ship and the reason of our visit, but it was obvious he thought we lied. All the same, he gave us the information we wanted as to supplies and water. Practically nothing was to be had. As it would be shortly our men's dinner hour, we persuaded him to come with us aboard, and he thawed considerably under the influence of luncheon. He told us the cocoa palms had been planted by his father, and that his name was Guadia. The sailing instructions as to this place are quite wrong. Moreover, they seldom quote their authority or the date of the information they give, which renders them very untrustworthy. About 20 fever-stricken natives, many of them cripples from elephantiasis, live here permanently on the plantation under the flimsy shelters. Senor Guadia said he lives usually in the city of Panama, but came over for some months during the healthy season, occupying a somewhat superior hut in the midst of the native shacks. There are comparatively high hills close to hand that would be infinitely more healthy as a residential site. He will probably get infected from the natives. The mosquitoes pass the disease along. As the watering scheme had broken down, we thought we would devote the afternoon to fishing. Senor Guardia said that, if we really wanted fish, we ought to go to the mouth of a river some distance away, but that the bottom was all clean opposite his camp, so we thought we would take a few drags of the seine along his front. We faked it down into the cutter and the launch towed her in. All along the beach, the water was almost soup-like from the mud in suspension. Also in it floated, in immense quantity, tiny fragments of fine marine grasses, the whole being kept constantly churned by the swell. In this opaque water, fish could not see the net. Casting off from the launch, the cutter backed into the beach. One hand jumped ashore with the head and foot ropes. She then described a semicircle as she shot her net. Our seine was 50 fathoms long and 2 fathoms deep. As she completed this semicircle by touching the beach, the spare hands jumped ashore with the other head and foot ropes, and the boat pulled away to the launch to land that party. For without them it was impossible to haul the net. The resistance was far too great. The natives, the whole population of the huts, grouped themselves together at a little distance, but never offered to lend a hand. At last we got a move on the net, but the resistance was excessive, and we were afraid that she had picked up something. Gradually, however, the line of buoying corks rose to the surface as the leaded foot rope took the ground, defining the semicircle with a row of dots, whilst over them jumped, at various points of the most distant part of the curve, a multitude of small fry, like a stream of silver darts and with rain-like patter as they struck the water. Gradually, the escaping captives became larger and larger, springing high into the air, and we thought that we should find but little left when we got the net ashore, for the weight in it was such that we could move it but slowly. "Keep her up! Keep her up!" was now the cry, to counteract the tendency to haul on either head rope or foot rope unduly in the excitement of the finish. For a seine is simply a moving vertical wall of net and must be maintained as such in use. At last the contained area began to simmer, then to boil, and then, still hauling evenly, we brought the mass more or less upon and against the sandy beach. Practically it was solid fish of every size, shape, and color. There was comparatively little weed. By their very number they had been rendered helpless. This was great good luck, for amongst them was a large shark, some 10 or perhaps 12 feet long, and another brute of about the same size and weight, but he chiefly consisted of head, and his head chiefly consisted of mouth. When this mouth, with 2 little eyes at the sides, looked at you, the shark seemed of benevolent appearance. Of course, our first thought was for the safety of the net. That it was not burst or torn already seemed a miracle. The struggles of the 2 great brutes would tear it to pieces if we tried to haul them right ashore, so we just held them jammed against the sloping beach. The natives then cautiously ventured to attack them with their machetes, a powerful slashing knife, like a small saber used for clearing the forest growth. They directed all their efforts to slashing them along the spine. Gingerly approaching the fish by the head, they inflicted the wounds nearer and nearer toward the tail. Having paralyzed that, they then blinded them. They did not desire to kill. They wanted the fish to have enough life left in it to be able to struggle away. Having thus paralyzed our 2 largest captures, we slipped a bowline around their tails and dragged them clear of the net and started them off, when they were at once torn to pieces by their fellows. We then proceeded to collect the useful part of the catch. We took what we wanted, the natives appropriated the rest. These natives were not an attractive lot, neither the men, the women, nor the children. They would not lend a hand to haul, got 3/4 of the catch for picking it up, and then tried to steal the balance that we had reserved. Signor Guardia gave us some coconuts and the antlers of a deer that he had shot. According to him, they are plentiful on the island. As we didn't want anybody to get bitten by mosquitoes and sunset was approaching, the order was now, "All aboard the lugger," and we reached the ship as her riding light ran up. End of section 27. Read by Carolyn Seyfarth, April 2023.
Section 28 of The Mystery of Easter Island, The Story of an Expedition. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ashley Gaddy. The Mystery of Easter Island, The Story of an Expedition by Katherine Routledge. Panama to Jamaica. Chapter 23, Panama to Jamaica. Navigation of the Gulf of Panama, Balboa and the City of Panama, Through the Canal, Cristobal, An Incapable Pilot, The Education of a Cook, A Waterspout, A Further Exciting Experience. Our job was now to get to the entrance of the canal, which is situated at the bottom of the bight of the Gulf of Panama. It is a most difficult one for a sailing vessel. Roughly speaking, currents from the southeast may be said to sweep round its coasts, and to form of the Gulf one vast eddy. Here, throughout the year, persists calms and catspaws from all directions, rain, lightning, and squalls, the whole caboodleum of the doldrums, plus a complex tangle of irregular currents. In addition to the foregoing joys, there is, towards the head of the Gulf, a large area studded with islands, rocks, and coral patches. From this archipelago have been obtained, from the earliest times, at the price of infamous cruelty, a large supply of the finest pearls. The group is called the Pearl Islands. A vessel unaided by steam power will experience considerable difficulty and delay in getting out of Panama Bay, say the sailing directions. She will, and so she does in getting into it. There is a well-known yarn of a ship being here carried round and round for a year or so, in the olden days, until her people had nearly all perished from scurvy. Some of the American newspapers got hold of this story and said we had found and relieved her, giving pathetic details. In our case, though we had a motor that gave us 5½ knots through the water, we found that our only course was to allow ourselves to be carried right across the mouth of the Gulf to the Colombian coast, and then to work up along the coast of the Isthmus of Darien, i.e. along the eastern shore of the Gulf of Panama. The following summary of our log will show what things are like. We left Fay Harbor, Quibo Island, at 8:10 a.m. on Thursday, March the 9th, and motored until noon, then got the canvas on her. Light airs, east, north-northeast, north, south-southeast, southeast by east, between noon and midnight. Made good 17½ miles. Much lightning all around in the first watch. The middle watch of Friday the 10th had easterly airs that gave her an average of 3 knots and much lightning. At 9:50 a.m. started motor and ran it until 0:50 p.m., and again from 3:24 p.m. to 5:45 p.m. Notwithstanding our using power, it was 10 p.m. before the light on Cape Mala could be entered in the log as just dipping. The motor was only called upon when the current was setting her into what would be a dangerous position. This day we make good 38½ miles. On Saturday the 11th of March, we found there was a strong southerly set at 11 a.m. and a north-northwest breeze, so, instead of steering to Panama, we altered course to take full advantage of the breeze to cross the Gulf. We passed from time to time well-defined current ripples, with much rubbish floating in the dead water. During the afternoon, the water became very dark and discolored, but we got no bottom at 225 fathoms. At 10 p.m., however, we got 55 fathoms, so we hove to and waited for the daylight. Our day's run was 79 miles. At earliest daylight on Sunday the 12th, we bore away and at 7:15 a.m. made Cape Escarpado bearing north 42 degrees east. The morning was very hazy with much mirage, and the land very difficult to recognize at any distance. We were now working to windward to the entrance of the Pearl Islands. At 1:35 p.m., we started the motor, and at 4:50 p.m. brought up for the night in 13 fathoms, between Monge and Puercos Islets, which lie off the east coast of the large Isla del Rey. We have done 60 miles today. On Monday, the 13th of March, we made a start at 5 a.m. under sail, working against light airs from north-northwest westerly. We were now being swept up into the Bight of Panama by the current, so all we had to do was keep her nicely placed. At noon, when we were distant from canal entrance 48 miles, we were obliged to start the motor and did 16 miles under power, stopping at 3:26 p.m. We then got a gentle northwest breeze, which we kept till 11:40 p.m., when we brought up off the entrance of the canal. Early the next morning, a harbor launch with the port officials came to us. They told us that the canal had been closed to all traffic for 5 months. According to them, our chance of being allowed to pass through was small indeed. As soon as we had got pratique, we started in our launch for the shore to learn our fate. From the port of Balboa on the Pacific to the port of Colon on the Atlantic is 44 miles by canal. By sea, the distance is 10,500. If the powers that were would not let us through, we must practically again circumnavigate the whole continent of South America. We had already done it once to a very large extent, Pernambuco to Valparaiso. Was it to be our fate to do it a second time? Though Mana was anchored close to the entrance of the fairway, yet she was hull down on our looking back when we were abreast of the Balboa frontage. So great is the length of the dredged channel through the smooth shoal water of the bay, before the canal begins to have visible land on either side of it. Messrs. Balfour, Guthrie and Company of San Francisco had most kindly advised their agents of our being en route, and consequently, when we landed at Balboa, there was a motorcar in waiting. We whisked off, got fresh meat and vegetables for the ship, put it aboard the launch, and dispatched her with orders to return to take us off an hour before dark. Then we drove straight to the city of Panama to call in the British minister, Sir Claude Mallet. He was most kind. He sent us under convoy of the consul to see Colonel Harding, the acting chief of the canal in the absence of Colonel Goethals. Colonel Harding was pleased to grant Mana the exceptional privilege of at once passing through the canal, on the ground that she was a scientific research ship, a favor for which we owe much gratitude both to him and to the government which he represented. We have sometimes, however, regretted this stroke of luck, as, had we been compelled to take the southerly route, we should have been at Punta Arenas just at the time Sir Ernest Shackleton was there seeking a vessel to rescue his men from Elephant Island, a job for which Mana was eminently fitted. In accordance with arrangements made, next morning a pilot came off and took us, under our own power, from the outer anchorage up the dredged channel to the mooring dolphins opposite Balboa, a distance of about 5 miles. Balboa is the name of a new town built by the Americans on the eastern bank of the Pacific entrance of the Panama Canal. The ground on which it is situated is not flat. Also, there are a couple of isolated volcanic cones that rise to a height of 363 feet and 650 feet respectively in its midst. A fine sanitary city has been designed and largely brought into being, and as the work of construction of the canal proceeds towards completion, for there is still much work to be done, so everything connected with the canal will be concentrated there. To this new town of Balboa adjoins the old city of Panama, the capital of the Republic of Panama, but now isolated from the rest of the Republic, being entirely surrounded by USA territory. Before we go through the canal, it will be well to have a general idea of its character. Let us first consider that of the Suez. The Isthmus of Suez is a level neck of sand, only slightly raised above sea level. Across it, a gutter has been dug. The Mediterranean Sea, unobstructed, flows along that gutter until it blends its waters with those of the Red Sea. The Panama is an entirely different proposition. The Isthmus of Panama is a neck of land formed of volcanic debris and rock. It is only partially level. It is humped in the middle, but that hump is hollowed like a saucer. So we have this sequence: a level, a hump, a level. The canal, therefore, is made in this way. Firstly, the middle, or humped part, is changed by means of embankments from a semi-dry saucer into a deep, high-level pond, i.e., into a pond whose surface is 85 feet above the level of the sea. That pond is filled, and kept filled, with sweet water by the rainfall on high country around it, the inner slope of the edge of the saucer. As we are only concerned with two embankments which go to form the pond, we will refer to one as the eastern and to the other as the western. Next, the Pacific Ocean is brought up a distance of about 4 miles to the foot of the western embankment by digging a simple gutter through level country, just as has been done in the case of the Suez. Similarly, the Atlantic is brought a distance of about 5 miles to the foot of the eastern embankment. Finally, each embankment is equipped with a series of water steps, or locks, whereby a vessel is lifted up from the ditch into the pond, or lowered from the pond into the ditch. Water of the pond, in measured doses of a lockful at a time, and on which dose float one or more ships, is first shut off from the pond, and is then permitted gently to escape into the Pacific Ocean ditch, or into the Atlantic Ocean ditch, as the case may be. No drop of Atlantic seawater ever mingles with the sweet water of the central pond. No drop of Pacific seawater ever mingles with the sweet water of the central pond. The Atlantic with the Pacific do not commingle directly or indirectly. Punctually at 7 a.m., the canal pilot boarded us, and we left Balboa 7:35 a.m. under our own power, and proceeded up the canal. It was a real pleasure trip. Engines running to perfection. Pilot most complimentary to them. No navigating to be done. The men highly content at the information that, once through the lock gates, the ship would be in fresh water, and they could wash clothes all day long. Largesse of soap distributed. We reached the Miraflores locks at 8:15 a.m. Distance from Balboa about 2 miles. The shores of the canal between Balboa and Miraflores present little of interest. The canal is here simply a ditch cut through a swamp. We enter the lower dock. The water of the pond above our heads is let in, and we rise about 54 feet. The doors in front of us open, and we pass out into a pool. From this pool we enter a second lock. We again rise about 31 feet. The gates in front of us open, and we are floating in an arm of the artificially formed Gatun Lake. This lake or pond or saucer is of considerable extent, about 1/3 the size of the Isle of Wight. Here it is deep, there it is shallow. What were marshes when it was still unflooded have now become its deeps. What were hillock or hilltops now appear as isolated islands. It is between such islands that the ship channel threads. A remarkable feature is that the islands, each of which was lately a hilltop, have as yet no horizontally cut shore or strand. The slope of the hillside is the same below the surface of the water as above it. The waves have not yet cut a shore bench or shelf. The trees, therefore, stand immersed in varying degree, some with the foot of the trunk only just awash, others with their topmost boughs only just showing. Where the bottom of the pond is level, large areas of now dead but still standing forest trees present a remarkable, because a transient, feature. Presently these will decay and disappear, then the water surface of the pond will appear to be greater than it does today. At 10:10 a.m. we passed out of the western, Miraflores and Miguel, locks, and proceeded across the pond, and reached the other side, the entrance to the eastern locks, the Gatun locks, at 4:51 p.m. Here we moored ship, as the canal people would not drop us from the pond into the Atlantic ditch that night. We observed that the USA were not taking any risks that they could avoid of German agents causing trouble. Sentries were posted everywhere, and no one from the ship was allowed to wander about ashore. Somana's crowd sat in a row on the edge of the lock, like migrating martins on a telegraph wire, and swung their legs in high good humor. Saturday, March the 18th, at 8:07 a.m., we entered the Gatun locks. At 8:53 p.m., passed out, and at 10 a.m. came to anchor in Colon Harbor. That afternoon we moored alongside a pier and took aboard coal, petroleum, and lubricating oil. The British consul, Mr. Murray, was most kind and hospitable, and though the flat mud island on which Cristobal stands, and of which it occupies the greater part, is unusually uninteresting, as is also the town, yet, owing to Mr. Murray, we quite enjoyed a week's detention there that fate had in store for us. As a vessel streams down the gutter, Gatun Approach, that runs in a straight line from the eastern embankment, Gatun Dam, into the Atlantic, Caribbean Sea, she has on her starboard hand, as she approaches the termination of the gutter, a small flat island of alluvium. The canal waterfront of that island is occupied now by wharves and jetties, behind which runs a good road bordered with fairly respectable shops and stores and drinking dens. At one end is a large and good hotel, at the other the stores, workshops, and residences of the canal officials. To all this is given the name of Cristobal, long O. Immediately against Cristobal, and forming part of it, abuts the town of Colon, another long O, a town that practically sprang into being at the first making of the canal, a twin sister to the town of Suez of the olden days for vice and villainy. If Colon be what it is now, with the USA in control, what must it have been of yore? We believe that the canal administration allows the citizens of the Republic of Panama some sort of self-government as regards their town of Colon, hence its character. The redeeming point about it is that it is so frequently and largely burnt to the ground that it will eventually become quite reasonably sanitary. At present, Cristobal is the executive center on the canal. Here are all the workshops. Balboa, at the other end, is today the administrative center only, but gradually all interests connected with the canal will there be concentrated. To Cristobal is brought, and from Cristobal is drawn, all labor and supplies. All food consumed throughout the canal zone, meat, fresh fish, vegetables, fruit, is sent frozen from the USA and there kept in cold storage. No supplies practically are derived from the surrounding country. It is only by the courtesy of the canal administration that anyone, not in its employ, is allowed to purchase food at its depots. Any foreigner, therefore, whose work requires him to live in the canal zone, finds housekeeping a very difficult matter. In our case, however, by the regulations, we were entitled to purchase what we wanted, but the same regulations specially state that any yacht, USA or foreign, shall be charged 20% more than any other vessel for any food supplied, or services rendered to her, and we were charged accordingly. And this, though the administration had only allowed us to pass through on the ground that we were not a yacht. In no sense were we one. To an Englishman it seems strange to find that another people considers it to the interest of the state to differentiate against yachts. We know, in our case, what our nation has gained by the widespread and intelligent interest in maritime affairs. That is the outcome of the British sport of yachting. Having got all our essential stores aboard on the day of our arrival, Saturday, we hoped to be able to get fresh provisions, pay dues, and clear on the Monday. But now our troubles began. There were at this time certain repairs that it was desirable should be done to portions of our machinery. They were not essential, as we had substituted new spares for each defective part, but we thought it wise, as we were now at the only port where we could get the work done, to get the damaged parts renovated so as to become spares in their turn. The original idea was to send down the parts by boat, but eventually the machine shop desired the vessel to be laid alongside its wharf. No vessel by the regulations is allowed to be moved without a canal pilot aboard her. He takes absolute command and control. A pilot accordingly took her alongside all right. Then arose delays, but everybody was most obliging, and the work was well done, though the course prices were very high. Meantime, our kindly consul was doing all he could to arrange for us to have a day's tarpon fishing from the Gatun Weir. From hearsay it is most thrilling work. You stand on the great weir with the water boiling in foam 85 feet beneath you, and play a real fighting fish of 100 to 200 pounds weight. The gentleman who was to have run us up to Gatun in his launch, and to have helped us to get a fish, was, however, unavoidably detained. Day followed day with the vessel alongside the wharf and the repair work in the workshops. At this time we were much amused by an old Jamaican colored man, who spent most of the day sitting on the quay beside the vessel close to her stern, where of course the ensign was flying on the flagstaff. He, like all the British Western Indian colored people, of whom there is a very large number at Cristobal Colon, was enthusiastically loyal and told us, "I love to sit under de old flag. While you here, I do no more work. All de day I sit under de old flag." The men took a fancy to him, and de old flag found something to spare for him at every meal, and a pipe of baccy afterwards. At last the repairs were completed, shore accounts all settled up, and the canal pilot took charge to take us out. We had to go out of the pool's stern foremost. It turned out subsequently that the Gatun locks were at this time passing a vessel through. This caused a current to flow past the pierhead of the dock. The pilot did not know of it, with the result that Mana's stern crashed into the pierhead. Luckily, the piling was very old and rotten, and mana extraordinarily strong, so that, though the pierhead structure was pretty considerably smashed, our own damage was confined to broken taffrail stanchions and the ironwork of the main gallows. We had therefore to return to our berth and have this new lot of damage made good. The pilot, a Greek, of course tried to make out that the reversing gear had refused duty when he wanted to handle her. But before we could find the captain of the port, that official had already been aboard and tried the engine, and told us that he found it worked to perfection, and gave us the true cause of the accident. We then asked him to give orders that our damage should be made good by the canal administration free of charge, but this he assured us was impossible under the regulations. We must pay, but the job should be expedited. He also, out of sympathy with our misfortunes, gave us permission, when our job was done, this time to take our ship out ourselves without having another canal pilot aboard, lest something worse should happen. And this we eventually did, to our own great satisfaction. Before, however, we could get our clearance, we had to deposit a sum equal to double the estimated cost of our repairs. The canal administration, like the British Post Office, always plays pitch and toss on the terms of heads I win, tails you lose. It very properly compels you to take a pilot. It gives him absolute power and requires that he himself shall take command and handle the vessel. But such a man's experience is confined to big steamers. With them he is probably quite skillful, but give him a small craft or a yacht and he knows as much about handling her as he does of piloting an airplane. Hence those tiers. The foregoing is equally true of the Suez Canal pilots. The risks to a small craft in the passage of the ship canals are great, and are solely due to the pilots being permitted to attempt to handle them. As the regulations of the Panama Canal stand, the pilot may be mad, or drunk, or incompetent, and elect to ram another vessel, or to butt at a lock gate. Nevertheless, all damage done to the ship, or by the ship, must be paid by the owners of the ship, before she is allowed to leave the canal. Under no circumstances will the administration accept responsibility for the conduct of their pilots. And there you have it. At 9:15 a.m., Sunday, March the 26th, 1916, we passed through the breakwater into the Caribbean Sea. We had cleared from Cristobal Colon for Trinidad, one of our West Indian islands, but when doing so, we never had any intention of going there. We informed the British consul of our reasons and had his sanction. German sympathizers seemed to take a most kindly interest in us. We were really bound for Bermuda, via the Windward Passage, which is the pass between the two great islands of Cuba and St. Domingo. A strong wind and current sweep at this time of year from east to west the length of the Caribbean Sea. Consequently, we had to get well to the eastward so as to make sure of carrying a fair wind and current for rounding Cape Tiburon, the western extremity of the island of St. Domingo. We therefore at once set to work to beat steadily to windward along the Venezuelan coast, keeping close in with the land in order to cheat the current and to have as little sea as possible. As this coast is only roughly surveyed and the lighting cannot be depended on, we exercised special care when standing in to the land. We saw no craft along this coast except that, one night, what looked like a small tramp steamer of about 800 tons entirely changed her course, and bore down on us until she was close alongside. She did not attempt to communicate. We kept our course and took no notice of her. After a good look at us, she took herself off. We had unfortunately lost, at Cristobal, our excellent and popular Japanese cook, and the colored Panama man who replaced him proved, after being given some days of grace, such a miserable impostor that even the strenuous and varied educational efforts of the forecastle failed to bring about his regeneration. We heard, indirectly, that the Russian Finn decided that it was a case of demoniacal possession and had attempted to cure it by means of a course of massage of the windpipe. Others of the crew suddenly became afflicted with a variety of complaints for which they drew various drastic drugs from the ship's medicine chest and then, with great self-sacrifice, refraining from taking these themselves, administered them instead to the chef. We aft got along quite comfortably, as the cabin steward, Edwin Young, belonged to Pitcairn Island and became, since joining, quite a good cook and was most willing and hard-working. But the forecastle very naturally complained, so, in its earnest, we decided to alter our course and make for Port Royal, Jamaica, to seek that pearl of price, a good sea cook. Nothing calling for remark occurred on this run until the 6th of April. At 6:15 a.m. on that day, Mr. Gillam, whose watch it was, came below and said, "I wish you would come on deck, sir. There's a waterspout bearing down on us." In half a shake of a lamb's tail we were on deck, and a truly wonderful and impressive sight presented itself. Away on our starboard bow was a vast, dark purple cloud mass shaped like an open umbrella, or rather a vaulted roof with central pendant. The upper surface of the dome blended with the normal clouds. The edge of the dome was sharply defined, and from its small fragments of cloud, all ragged and looking like pearl-gray silk muslin torn off and crumpled, kept breaking away to be left behind. The dome-shaped mass, on its lower aspect, gradually became columnar. The column extended downward until it almost, but not quite, reached the sea. The lower part of its length was much attenuated and convoluted and terminated in ragged mist, and could be seen to be rotating rapidly. The surface of the sea beneath it, over an area of perhaps a mile in diameter, presented the appearance of a fiercely boiling cauldron. The water rose up as waves of pyramidal form, from which the wind tore off the apices and whipped the same into spume. The waves had no fixed direction, they simply dashed into one another. Immediately beneath the ragged termination of the central column, the surface of the sea seemed to be bodily lifted up, amidst a welter of mist and froth and spray, into a cone-shaped form. But between the apex of this cone and the rapidly rotating extremity of the column of cloud above it, there always remained a distinct interval of considerable extent that had the appearance of dense mist, the appearance of a hard rain squall, seen from afar, as it sweeps over the sea. The cloud came down towards the sea, and the sea rose up towards the cloud, and there was an interval betwixt the two. The column was not quite vertical, though it maintained perfect continuity with the cloud mass above, of which it formed a part. Nevertheless, its lower extremity tended somewhat to trail or lag behind. It moved along its path towards us, quite slowly and steadily, cutting our wake at an acute angle some miles astern. It is difficult to conjecture what would happen to a small craft, or to any craft, that found itself well within the area of disturbance. Apart from anything else, the seas, tumbling down onto the top of her from all quarters, even if they did not break in her decks, could hardly fail to strip her hatch openings. As we watched, we agreed that even Mana could scarcely be expected to live amidst such seas, and therefore, obviously, nothing could. As it was, the surface of the sea, where we were, was little affected, nor was there any weight in the shifts of wind as they occurred. We then had breakfast and a pipe and settled down to routine work when, at 10 a.m., a small cloud on the horizon, on our lee bow, was observed to be behaving in a way opposed to the ordinary laws of nature. Though a nice steady breeze was blowing and no other clouds were to be seen anywhere else in this direction on the horizon, yet this one particular patch, like a large sail, remained constant in form and in the same position. As we drew nearer, it was observed to increase and diminish in volume from time to time. The only explanation we could think of was that we had fallen in with a ship on fire, so we bore away towards it. As we reduced the distance betwixt us and it, we gradually made out that it was not one cloud of white smoke, but two separate clouds that arose, more or less alternately, at two spots situated some 2 miles or so apart. Another point, too, gradually developed. Each patch of cloud or smoke suddenly burst forth to its maximum size and then gradually blew to leeward and dissipated. This led us to think that it must be either gun practice or a naval action. The wind had now fallen light, so we started our engines and made up our canvas, and, like rats, headed for the scrimmage. It was suggested that, following the classical example of Mr. Midshipman Easy, a lady's wardrobe aboard should be overhauled to find, if possible, a green silk petticoat under which we might go into action. As in Easy's case, being unarmed, our approach was likely to be of greater effect than our presence, but still we all decided to make a claim for prize money. As we cut down the distance, it became evident that it could only be a matter of small craft, for no hull could be made out. The fighting was taking place on the northern side of Morant's Cays, a group of low-lying coral islets that lay between us and the combatants. The situation gradually developed. Morant's Cays are coral islets perched on the top of a volcanic area. There had been a seismic disturbance of considerable extent. We had the large-scale Admiralty plan of them. Great changes had taken place. The sea was now breaking in various directions where deep water was shown on the chart. At 2 points, from vents in the sea bottom, steam was being ejected into the air in puffs, each puff forming a dense white cloud perhaps 200 or more feet high. These puffs occurred some 1.5 miles apart, and one was much larger than the other. The steam was ejected from each vent alternately. We came in pretty close, but breaking water in various directions warned us that we were looking for trouble, so we headed away for Port Royal, Jamaica. End of section 28.
Section 29 of The Mystery of Easter Island, The Story of an Expedition. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sally Morell. The Mystery of Easter Island, The Story of an Expedition by Katherine Routledge. Jamaica to Southampton. Chapter 24. Jamaica to Southampton. Jamaica and the Bahamas, Bermudas, Azores, preparing for submarines, Southampton once more. Jamaica. Jamaica was discovered by Columbus and belonged to Spain till 1655, when it was captured by an expedition sent out by Oliver Cromwell. The island, from its proximity to the Spanish possessions, was a godsend to the buccaneers. Port Royal, which, as its name shows, was founded after the Restoration, was full of riches, often ill-gotten, always like a continental mart or fair. In 1692 it was overwhelmed by an earthquake and again laid low by fire in 1703. Kingston, originally begun as a settlement of refugees from Port Royal after the earthquake, gradually grew in importance and finally became the capital of the island. During the wars which followed the French Revolution, Jamaica was of importance as the great centre of British interests in the Western Caribbean. We now headed for Jamaica. Kingston, its capital, lies towards the eastern extremity of its southern coast. The town is placed on flat land which gradually rises into dwarf hills. It is built parallel to and abutting onto its waterfront. Right and left of the city when viewed from the sea extends low country, whilst behind it and to the east rises in the distance a lofty range of mountains. From the open sea, the town and flat country is divided by a natural breakwater that maintains the general trend of the coast. By this breakwater is formed a lagoon that runs east and west parallel to the coast for a distance of some 6 miles, with an average breadth of about 1 mile, and has practically no arms or branches. This lagoon is the harbour of Kingston, and a fine one, but it lacks the element of picturesqueness, nor is it a comfortable one for small craft. The strong easterly wind, known as the Undertaker, that daily arises and increases in strength with the sun, sweeps down its length and knocks up a nasty sea. It is difficult to obtain shelter even for a dinghy when landing at Kingston. But we are anticipating. We ran down the coast close in, and at 9:30 a.m. Friday, April the 7th, 1916, we reached the western end of the natural breakwater, between which and the mainland is the passage into the lagoon. Here the port doctor came on board, and as he went through our bills of health, we mutually discovered that we were old hospital friends, though we had never heard of each other for 20 years. We entered the harbour, and brought up in 15 fathoms abreast of the wharf of the old naval dockyard of Port Royal, and distant from it about a cable's length. Port Royal is situated on the inner aspect of the bulbous-headed western extremity of the natural breakwater. The land surface is very limited in extent, and is entirely taken up with the old fort, the old dockyard, and old naval and military quarters. All but a few poor closely packed houses is in the occupation of government. The width of the breakwater to the eastward soon becomes small, open beach on seaward side, mangroves extending into the lagoon on the other, and between the two, sand and scrub. This part is the well-known Palisadoes, the home of land crabs and dead men, and the scene of many a duel. Port Royal is now deserted, no shipping or living workshops, Everything is hushed, but the place is not neglected. Nelson might have left it but yesterday. The dockyard, with its fittings, stores and quays, reminded one of that other quaint little marine gem, the old naval dockyard of English Harbour in the island of Antigua. When the place hummed with life, The Young Sea Officer's Sheet Anchor by Faulkner was the textbook to work by, and its social life is vividly and accurately given us by Marryat in one of his novels. As in the dusk, all alone, we passed down the silent corridors and approached the old mess room. We somehow listened for and expected at any moment to hear, through some opening door, the reckless toast of "a bloody war and a sickly season," the chink of glasses, and the crash of the chorus, "Yellow Jack, Yellow Jack," and Jack, thus bidden, used to come and link his arm in that of some fine young fellow, and together the two would saunter away, to the home of a friend of his in the Palisadoes. Little time for packing up aloud. Many and many a man in the prime of life and feeling quite well has dined at mess one night in snowy uniform, the next night in a white uniform of a different cut, as the guest of Jack and Death. These two kept open house in those days. The R.E. officer in charge was most kind and hospitable. He took us over the old fort, pointing out amongst much else Nelson's former quarters and the adjoining length of parapet overlooking the harbour entrance, now known as Nelson's Walk. Our host informed us that, fishing from the wharves, he got splendid sport. From Port Royal to Kingston is about 4 miles by the boat channel. Passes through coral banks have been blasted, where requisite, and the channel beaconed. A least depth of 4.5 feet is thus obtained, and a direct course. Our little motor lifeboat carried us backwards and forwards most excellently on various voyages made to attend to our business at Kingston. The way in which she bucked at speed over the short, steep seas reminded one of larking over hurdles on a pony. The work in hand was to get our clearance inwards, to get rid of our food destroyer from Panama, and to find in his place a live ship's cook, to report particulars of the Morant's Cay's upheaval, and finally the usual catering, and bill of health, and clearance outwards. The Chief of Customs was good enough to interest himself in Manners' welfare, so that all these matters were dealt with in due sequence and with the least possible trouble to us. A coloured cook was procured from an hotel at £16 a month, with, as it proved, but little justification on the ground of ability for drawing such a rate of pay. Still, his professional enormities were associated with so many humorous incidents, and as he appeared at least to mean well, we resigned ourselves to the inevitable and prayed that we might survive his ministrations. About noon on Sunday, April 9th, 1916, we weighed and motored out from Port Royal, unplagued by pilots, and dipping our ensign to the port doctor and his wife, in acknowledgment of adieu waved from their garden. Clear of everything, the engines were stopped, and Manor, bound to the stormy Bermudes, proceeded to argue the point with a headwind as to whether she should or should not go to windward. By steady hammering she gradually got under the westward end of the island of San Domingo, and then through the celebrated Windward Passage. We had now to thread our way betwixt the numerous islets that constitute the Bahama group, and it was quite delightful and interesting. Brilliant sunshine, cool moderate breezes, land every few hours, but reliable charts. This was yachting. We had met a good deal of what bore little semblance to it, so we appreciated our present luck all the more. The morning of the 19th of April 1916 saw us beating up under the lee of Acklin Island and of Crooked Island. A fresh northeast breeze swept in puffs across the long narrow flat land. An open native boat, with jib-headed mainsail as usual, was seen heading across our course when we were close in, so we gave her a wave, and as we came into the wind, she rounded to under our stern, dousing her sail, unshipping her mast, and shooting up alongside our quarter. We dropped into her, A couple of empty sacks were pitched in, and she was clear of the ship before she had lost her way. The mast is stepped, the sail hoisted, and she is off again with her gunwale steadily kept awash. We now for the first time spoke. The 2 coloured men, her crew, were most obliging. They would make for the most convenient landing, and then they would accompany us, catering. Everything went off excellently. We made a tour to different cottages and gardens, collecting whatever was available, particularly grapefruit, oranges and tamarinds. We also got exceptionally fine specimens of the shell of the king conch and of the queen conch. Hundreds of the king conch were piled up at one spot on the shore, ready to be burnt into lime. The natives appeared to be pure-blooded Negroes of West Coast type, and in some respects their culture remains unchanged. For instance, the pestle and mortar and winnowing tray for treating maize were exactly similar in pattern to those we had seen used by the Akikuyu of eastern Central Africa. When catering, the price of each article is settled by negotiation, and it is definitely bought, as it is met with from time to time in our perambulation, on condition that it shall be paid for as it is passed into the boat on departure, cash on delivery. Much other stuff, though on board, is also brought down to the boat in the hope of sale at the last moment. This too is generally taken as well, because going cheaply, and also to avoid causing disappointment. Everybody having been paid, and the already laden boat now pretty well cluttered up with an unexpected additional cargo of chickens, eggs, fruit, shells, and sundry ethnological acquisitions, up goes the shoulder of mutton, the helmsman ships his twiddling stick, and in a few moments the water is purring beneath our lee gunwale as the little craft slithers through the closely set wavelets of land-sheltered water. Long, narrow, and ballasted, these boats are very fast and are given the last ounce of wind pressure they can stand up to. It seemed to us, however, that her crew wished to show what they could do with her, as halyard and sheet in hand, they lifted the lee gunwale from moment to moment, just sufficiently to prevent her filling. But they did so with an easy nonchalance that told that they were finished boat sailors. A very few minutes saw us once more aboard the lugger. We had left Mana at noon, and 8 bells were striking as the staysail sheet tackles scraped to leeward along the hairless belly of its horse. We'd explored an island, seen a good deal of its people and their culture, and had revictualled ship, all within 4 hours, yet without hurry. Towards sundown we passed out into the Atlantic through the Crooked Island Passage at 8:45 p.m. The light that marks the passage dipped over our taffrail, and we turned in with that peace of mind which is the portion of those whose ship is clear of all land. This day, April the 19th, Gibbs Hill Lighthouse, Bermuda, bore north 42 degrees east. Distant 767 miles. It took us 11 days to do it. April the 20th. The Sargasso weed formed floating islands, sometimes many acres in extent. When one considers the marine fauna that centres round a piece of floating wreckage in tropical seas, some idea can be formed of the wealth of life associated with this vast sud. Our patent log could no longer be towed. Bermudas. The Bermudas are a group of 100 islands, most of which are, however, bare rocks. They were discovered in the beginning of the 16th century by Juan Bermudez, a Spaniard. In 1609 attention was drawn to them by Sir George Somers, who was shipwrecked there on his way to Virginia, and found them the most plentiful place that ever I came to for fish, hogs, and fowl. 50 emigrants were sent out in 1612. Moore, a ship's carpenter, was the first governor. He established his headquarters at St. George's. Later a more central position was needed, and the town of Hamilton was laid out and became the capital in 1815. The American War brought the islands into notice from a naval point of view, and in 1810 a dockyard was begun on Ireland Island, thousands of convicts being sent out from England for its construction. The colony possesses representative institutions, but not responsible government. We made Bermuda for the sake of gaining our northing. We had new canvas awaiting us there that we ought to have received at Tahiti, and we had to decide on cable advices whether we would lay up manor here in Bermuda, in the United States of North America, or bring her back to England. The sailing directions offered us two harbours, St. George's and Hamilton. They do not point out that all shipping business, practically all business, is done at Hamilton. We selected St. George's. The harbour master came aboard with the pilot and proved an interesting man, kindly and obliging. An old soldier, a keen conchologist, and a bit of a geologist. The harbour itself is excellent and charming. It extends away ad infinitum amongst the islets and coral patches, but there is little indication of its being made much use of by mercantile shipping. St. George's Island is linked to its big neighbour by causeways and bridges, which are carried across the shallow coral sea. Its quaint, clean, sleepy little townlet or village exists by letting lodgings to American visitors and growing early vegetables for exportation to the States. The American tourist is the winter migrant whose nature and idiosyncrasies are by the islanders most deeply studied. He, to the Bermudian, is heaven's choicest gift, his coconut, the all-sufficing. 9/10 of the brain power of the islanders is devoted to inducing the creature to visit the islands and to keeping it contented whilst it is there. The other 10th to supplying it with early vegetables in its continental habitat. Of course, Bermuda is an important naval station, and a certain amount of business is done in purveying to the naval and military establishments, but that is a thing apart. The dockyard is situated on islands well removed from both St. George's and Hamilton. In this we may see the finger of Providence. Placed elsewhere, it would have incommoded the American tourist. This cult of the foreigner is the explanation of many things which at first sight appear strange in Bermuda. It is about 11 miles by road from St. George's to Hamilton, and there is no means of public conveyance beyond a covered pair-horse wagonette that acts as a carrier's cart for goods and passengers. We marvelled exceedingly why this should be, whereupon it was thus explained to us by our butcher, who was also the proprietor of the Shandy Ran Express aforesaid, and of a hired carriage business, and by his son and partner, the MP for the St. George's Harbour Division. The Americans find the climate of Bermuda delightful as a winter resort. At Hamilton, monster hotels are built for them, but there is nothing whatever for them to do. The islands do not possess any features of natural or historical interest that appeal to tourists. Now the islanders had observed that the dominant note in the American character was its restlessness. Unless an American could violently rush around and spend money, he was wretched and pined. But the island had excellent roads and lovely views, so they provided carriages and objectives to drive to associated with romance and story, the evolution of which from a basis of nothing is a standing testimony to their intellectual creative powers and of the truth of the axiom that a demand creates a supply. But the island, for we may ignore the numerous islets, is very small. With care and good management, and by severely rationing him in the extent of his daily shay excursions, it was found that the American could be kept alive and healthy and cheerful for 14 days, from one steamer to the next. All this time he exuded dollars. All is well, as the ant said to the aphis. Then suddenly the heavens fell. A lewd spirit had prompted our friend the butcher of St. George's to import 2 motor buses, and with them run an hourly service between Port St. George and Hamilton, to the great convenience of the public and to his own exceeding profit. As if this were not enough, he and others were known to have even placed orders in the States for motor cars. Bitter was the cry of the carriage purveyors of Hamilton, of the hotels, of the furnished apartments. The American visitor would do the darned island, every inch of its roads, twice over in a single day, and get away by the same boat he had arrived by. The boat stayed 2 days loading vegetables. But where shall salvation be found if not in government of the people, by the people, for the people? Many members of both houses, indirectly and in some cases directly, were interested in the hired carriage or apartment or hotel lines. Trained in such schools for statesmen, the legislature was able to visualize the national danger and deal with it broadly, regardless of the vested interests of the day. Without delay, both houses met, an act was passed, and the royal assent given through the governor, whereby the butcher was given the cost price of his 2 buses and a solatium. The buses were immediately to be sent back to the States, and for the future no form of automobile was to be landed, owned, or used on the island. Heavy penalties for infraction. So there is still one spot on earth, anyhow, where one can escape the scourge of the motor horn. For a few days we stayed at St. George's, getting a little smith's work done and watering ship. There is no surface water on the island. The rainwater is collected and stored in great underground cisterns hewn in the solid coral rock of which the island is formed. The water supply thus conserved has never been known to fail. In Manna's case, the military authorities kindly sent their large tank boat alongside. At odd times we explored in the launch some of the labyrinth of waterways and islets forming part of St. George's Harbour or connected with it. When doing so one afternoon, we made the acquaintance at nightfall of a coloured fisherman by offering him the courtesy of a pluck home. This man, Bartram of St. George's, proved an extraordinarily good fellow. He said he never worked on Sundays, therefore he was free to offer to take us on that day, as his guest, to try for monsters in a certain wonderful hole, far out in the edge of the reef, a spot we could reach with the aid of our launch. He was most keen about it, so we accepted. The monster capturing was a failure, but he and his 2 sons worked hard all day, and seemed much concerned that they had failed to show sport, nor would they consider any suggestion of payment for their long day's work on our return to the ship. They accepted, however, a clasp knife each as a souvenir of our excursion. Bartram had told us that he had at home a wonderfully fine and rare marine specimen. The collection of marine specimens is one of the refuges of despair of the American tourist, and their supply has gradually become a minor industry of Bermuda. He had found it some years ago. Many millionaires from the hotels or on yachts had offered him big prices for it, but the very fact that they were so keen to get it had made him all the more determined to keep it. Some day he had intended to sell it. Now would we accept it as a gift? On inspection it proved to be no coral, but a very fine example of a colony of sociable sea snails, Vermetus. We therefore suggested to Bartram that we should take it to England on Manor, and offer it in his name as a gift to the British Museum, Natural History. This we did, and Dr. Harmer, the keeper of the zoological department, was much pleased with it, and wrote to Bartram accordingly. The interest of this little story lies in the fact of its being a typical example of the way in which one often finds in our remote dependencies the people exhibiting unexpected keenness and pride in associating themselves with England and her interests, on an opportunity of doing so being pointed out to them. We had found it so at Pitcairn Island. A more delightful place than Bermuda at which to spend a winter would be hard to find by those who care for pleasure, sailing in smooth waters, fishing, sunshine, and the customary amenities of civilized life. Unhappily, we could not spare the time to avail ourselves of the possibilities of St. George's. We had constantly to be at Hamilton on ship's business, so after several journeys to and fro in the dreadful covered wagonette, wherein physical discomfort almost rendered us indifferent to a kaleidoscopic succession of humorous persons, situations, and incidents, we got a pilot and went round under power into Hamilton Harbour. Pilotage is compulsory but free. Once at Hamilton things went much more easily. The colonial authorities and the Admiral in command and his staff were most kind and hospitable. Admiralty House is a charming 18th century English country residence of moderate size and romantically situated. In its garden, peeps of the sea are seen, through graceful subtropical foliage at every turn, and miniature landlocked coves, reached from above by winding steps down the face of the Falaise, afford the most perfect of boat harbours and bathing pools. Another delightful official residence is allotted to the officer in command of the dockyard. In his case, he is given a miniature archipelago. His tiny islands rise from 20 to 100 feet above the water. On one is his house, another is his garden. Chickens and pigs occupy a third, whilst his milk goats live on various small skerries. As the extent of water between the different islets is proportional to their size and is deep, the whole makes a very charming and compact picture, yet he's only 10 minutes by bicycle from his office in the dockyard, although from his little kingdom no sign of the dockyard is to be seen, it being shut off by a wooded promontory. The Admiral was good enough to offer us every facility for laying up manor in the dockyard, but on various grounds we eventually decided to take wartime risks and bring her back to England, so receiving from him a signal rocket outfit, and some kindly advice on the unwisdom of trying to run down periscopes that showed no wake behind them. The vessel being now refreshed at 0:55 p.m. on Friday, May the 12th, 1916, we weighed and proceeded under power from Hamilton to the examination anchorage with pilot aboard. Arriving there at 4:15 p.m., the examining officer came alongside and handed us the now usual special Admiralty clearance card, together with a courteous radiogram wishing us luck from the officer in command of the dockyard. The new trysail was hoisted, the engine stopped, and we commenced our voyage to Ponta Delgada in the island of St. Miguel, one of the Azores, distant miles 1,869. Bermuda to Azores. This run was of yachting character, gentle breezes, smooth seas, and occasional sail on the horizon. On the 8th day out, at the beginning of the first watch, the lights of St. Elmo were seen burning on both fore and main trucks. It is rather remarkable that this was the first and only occasion on which this phenomenon occurred throughout the entire voyage. Occasionally we got a turtle. 10 o'clock in the morning of 30th of May showed us the peak of Pico Island, 65 miles away, and at 10 p.m. next day, Thursday, May the 31st, we hove to off Ponta Delgada in the island of San Miguel to await daylight. The 1,869 miles had taken us 18 days. Having been the victims of the organised dishonesty of the pilots of San Francisco and California, we had long before decided to run no risks of having the vessel again detained for ransom by foreign officials. Manor, therefore, next day, June the 1st, simply stood in and dropped a boat outside the breakwater and again stood off whilst we pulled in. Being Good Friday, it was, of course, a fiesta, all shops shut, and everybody away in the country. Our consul, too, was away for the day, but his wife kindly gave us our letters. We had been instructed to obtain from him the necessary information regarding war conditions and the regulations governing shipping bound for British ports. At Bermuda nothing was known. When pulling up the harbour we had noticed one British vessel, an armed government transport, evidently formerly a small German passenger-carrying tramp, so having bought some pineapples, vegetables and cigarettes, nothing else being procurable, we got into our boat and paid her a visit. Her commander was ashore for the day with the consul, fiestering, but his chief officer was good enough to put us au courant with things, so we bade adieu to Ponta Delgada, without any wish to see more of it, and pulled out to sea. The ship was far away to leeward, set down by wind and current. Not expecting us to get through our work so quickly, she had not troubled to keep her station, but went off to argufy by flag with the Lloyd's signal station, which would not admit that she was in its book. After she had picked us up, one of the men left aboard asked whether any of the craft in the harbour were a hanging Judas. Though there were several small square-rigged vessels alongside the Mole, none had, however, cock-billed their yards. It was interesting thus to find that the memory and meaning of the old sea custom still survived. Old superstitions and fancies still exist. An ancient shellback, who was with us down to the Southard, reprobated the capture of an albatross. "They is the spirits of drowned seamen." Someone objected on doctrinal grounds, but was met with a crushing rejoinder. "I said spirits, their souls are in hell." Azores to Southampton. And now we come to the last lap. On June the 1st, by 1 p.m, we were again aboard Manor, the boat hoisted in, and she bore away to round Ferreira Point, which forms the extremity of St. Michael's Island. From Ferreira's Point to the haven where we would be was 1,101.5 miles, and the direction north 49 1/4 degrees east, true, or shall we say northeast. After making the customary routine entries in the logbook associated with taking departure, the latitude, the longitude, the reading of the patent log, the canvas set, etc., our sailing master makes the following entry. And now we are fairly on our way to dear old Britain. All the talk now is of the submarine risks. I put our chances of getting through unmolested at 85%, but is the Manor doomed? Time will tell, but I don't think. Nevertheless, every preparation was now made in case we had to leave the ship in a hurry at the orders of some German submarine. The engine was taken out of the lifeboat to save weight. Every detail, both for her and the cutter, was suitably packed or made up, and placed in the deck-house, ready to be passed into her at the last moment before she was lowered. We could only afford room for the photographic negatives and papers of the expedition. If the ship be sunk, the whole of the priceless, because irreplaceable, archaeological and ethnological collections must go with her. The men, however, proceeded to pack in their great seamen's bags all the clutter and old rubbish they had accumulated during a voyage of over 3 years. Its bulk and weight would have rendered the boats unmanageable. Moreover, each man, when the time came, would be attending to shipping his property, instead of giving all thought to getting his boat, with her essential equipment, safely away from the vessel. But we had taken them this long voyage without accident, and we were not going to let them make fools of themselves at the finish. Moreover, Manor carried a pretty mixed crowd: English, Spanish, Portuguese and West Indian negroes, a Russian Finn, and descendants of the mutineers of the Bounty. At a pinch, amongst such a lot, long knives are apt to appear from nowhere, and self-control and discipline be at an end, with a lamentable result. We therefore drew up a set of orders in triplicate, one copy for the forecastle, one for aft, and one for entry in the official log, in which was clearly set out a routine that was to be followed to the letter in the event of our having to take to the boats. The details need not here be given. Suffice to say that they stated that explicit orders for the common good were now set out in writing, and that these orders would not, when the occasion arose, be repeated verbally; that there was ample boat accommodation for all, if the lifeboat were got away safely from the ship before the cutter, but not otherwise, because all hands were needed to swing out the larger boat. Therefore, when the ship's bell rang, the sailing master would take up his position by the lifeboat in the waist, to superintend her launching and stowage, and to give orders, and eventually to take command of her, and the master would pick up his loaded repeating rifle and spare cartridges and clips, and go to the taffrail. It was obvious from that position he could see and hear everything, and yet could not be approached or rushed by any or many. Any man failing immediately to appear on deck when the bell rang would be shot dead without any warning when he did appear. Any man endeavouring to place his private gear in a boat would be shot dead in the act without any warning. The like if he attempted to enter other than his own boat, or his own boat out of his turn. The like on a long knife or other weapon being seen in his hand or possession. The like on his failing to obey the verbal orders as issued. By the routine laid down, the lifeboat would get away safely with her crew and equipment. The cutter's own crew was strong enough to load and lower their own boat, after having assisted the heavy lifeboat, provided they obeyed the orders of the mate who had charge of her. He was a good seaman, but it was essential that he should have the moral support that comes from a loaded rifle. Once boats all clear and safe, the lifeboat would pull into the ship, as close as she thought wise, whereupon the old man, in a nice cork jacket, would drop off his taffrail into the water and she would pick him up. These orders and the penalties, extreme as they were, met with general approval as far as we could gather indirectly. 2 days after their being posted, when Thomas, the coloured cook, came for orders, we thought we would put him through his catechism. "Have you learnt up the orders in the forecastle that concern you, Thomas?" "Yes, sir." "When the bell rings, what will you do?" "Jump deck. Quick, damn quick, sir." "Good. And then?" "I go starn big boat." "And when she's in the water, you'll jump into her?" "No, sir. You shoot, Thomas. Cutter's my boat." Thomas had got up his orders thoroughly and intelligently and departed quite pleased with his viva voce exam and the bundle of cigarettes his reward. Some of the men, finding that their kit bags must be left behind, hit out the following ingenious plan for saving their clothes. They first put on their Sunday best suit, over that their weekday go-ashore rig, then their working clothes. To the foregoing must be added a knitted guernsey or two, and any superior underclothing. The result was most grotesque. They could hardly waddle or get through the forecastle hatch. Had the fine weather continued, their sufferings would have been severe. A gale, however, in which no submarine could show her nose, came to their rescue. At the time we are writing of, June 1916, the submarines were not operating far out into the Atlantic. Our idea was to keep Manor well away until we got on to about the same parallel of latitude as the Scilly Isles, and then wait thereabouts until it blew hard from the southwest. Blow it did, sure enough, with high confused seas, dangerous. Gradually they became bigger but less wicked. We rode it out dry and comfortably as usual, with oil bags to windward. Unhappily, it was an easterly gale, instead of the westerly we had hoped for. It moderated. The wind drew to the nor'ard. We let her go and sped up the channel at a great pace and arrived in St. Helens Roads, Isle of Wight, at noon on June the 23rd, 22 days from San Miguel. We had entered and passed up the English Channel, unchallenged by friend or foe. In St. Helens Roads we took aboard the now obligatory government pilot who brought us through the different defences to the Hamble Spit buoy, from which we had started 3 years and 4 months earlier. We had traversed almost entirely under canvas, without accident of consequence to ship or man, a distance of over 100,000 miles. Such is the manner of manner. End of section 29. End of The Mystery of Easter Island, The Story of an Expedition, by Katherine Routledge.
Section 30 of The Mystery of Easter Island, The Story of an Expedition. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Larry Wilson. The Mystery of Easter Island, The Story of an Expedition, by Katherine Routledge. Epilogue and Itinerary of the Expedition. Epilogue. Manna was once more back in England, and her crew went each on his way. The Brixham and Lowestoft men returned to their homes, having at least enlarged their knowledge of the world. Rosa, the Chilean engineer, and the Jamaican cook disappeared to get engagements back to their respective lands. Rosa, we trust, to realize his dreams of a shop and a wife at St. Vincent. Mr. Gillam applied for service in the Royal Navy, and subsequently became a sub-lieutenant in the R.N.R. The two Pitcairners were the last left on board. They had proved themselves very intelligent as well as good workers. Charles could, it is believed, have passed an examination on every port he had visited, and how long he had stayed in each. We endeavored to make some amends for our lack of Mendelian research on their island by sending them up to the Royal College of Surgeons, where they were thoroughly measured and examined by Professor Keith. A still more signal honor awaited them. They were commanded to Buckingham Palace as representatives of England's smallest colony. Mr. Gillam took charge of them in London. He was not intimately acquainted with the great city, and used the map as he would a chart, disdaining the main thoroughfares unless they lay on the direct route, and steering a straight course by weird and mysterious alleys. Anyway, his charges were produced in good time at the palace. During the arrangements for the interview, S. had stated that the men spoke the pure Elizabethan English of the Bible and Prayer Book. Their vocabulary, however, had been enlarged on Mana, and I was not without trepidation lest such expressions might crop out as, "I don't mind if I do," which is considered at Brixham the most courteous form of polite acceptance. All, however, went well. Charles, who acted as spokesman after a first embarrassment, answered readily the questions asked by the king. The Queen graciously accepted some specimens of Pitcairn handiwork, and the men were much impressed with the kindness and condescension of their majesties. Incidentally, during the interview with which we were previously honored, they made great friends with the royal footman who was on duty outside. He was, of course, a very imposing person in scarlet and gold, and they shook hands affectionately with him on leaving. Cuttings from the newspapers of official and other paragraphs announcing the reception of the 2 inhabitants of Pitcairn by King George and Queen Mary were taken back by them to be inserted in the state records of the island. Posts were obtained for both men on a New Zealand liner, and we have since heard that they have safely returned to their home, having made the voyage from Tahiti on a little schooner which the plucky Pitcairners have built since we were there. It is to be hoped that this boat may continue a success and solve many of the problems of the island. This narrative cannot close without that note of pride and sadness which, alas, characterizes so many records at this time in the history of the world. Since the first chapter was written, 2 more of our company have laid down their lives. The words of appreciation which it was hoped would have given pleasure can only be wreaths to their memory. Charles Jeffrey of Lowestoft, who joined at Whitstable and was with us to the last, who grew from boyhood to manhood on Mana, has met with a hero's death on a minesweeper. Henry James Gillam rests in a Sicilian grave. Volunteers were called for specially dangerous work in capturing submarines. Gillam responded. It is impossible to picture his doing otherwise, and he fell in action in April 1918. The loss to his country is great. To us it is very real and personal. The whole voyage of the Mana is a tribute to his skill. His high intelligence and character secured him universal confidence, while his unvarying good temper, in bad times as well as in good, made him a delightful companion. One can only think of him in that other life as still keen for some new work or enterprise, and carrying it out with perfect loyalty and success. Thus, from land and sea, in defence of a great cause, have our comrades of the expedition made their last voyage westward. I know not where his islands lift their fronded palms in air. I only know I cannot drift beyond his love and care. Whittier. And now the story is told. The expedition has, we hope, brought some new pieces to fit into the puzzle which it went out to study, but the help is needed of every reader who has more to bring from whatever part of the world. So alone can be finally solved the mystery of Easter Island. Itinerary of the expedition. Outward voyage. Left Southampton, February 28, 1913. Dartmouth, March 1st to 5th, 1913. Falmouth, March 6th to 25th, 1913. Madeira, April 13th to 16th, 1913. Grand Canary, April 18th to May 12th, 1913. Cape Verde Islands, May 17th to 29th, 1913. Pernambuco, June 15th to 21st, 1913. Bahia de Todos os Santos, June 25th to 26th, 1913. Cabral Bay, July 2nd to 4th, 1913. Cape Frio, July 10th to 12th, 1913. Rio de Janeiro, July 14th to 23rd, 1913. Portobello Bay, July 27th to August 2nd, 1913. Buenos Aires, August 17th to September 19th, 1913. Port Desire, October 3rd to 6th, 1913. Entered Magellan Straits, October 16th, 1913. Punta Arenas, October 20th to November 29th, 1913. Entered Patagonian Channels, December 11th, 1913. Left Patagonian Channels, January 6th, 1914. Talcahuano, January 14th to February 13th, 1914. Juan Fernandez, February 16th to February 19th, 1914. Valparaiso, February 2nd to February 28th, 1914. Juan Fernandez, March 4th to March 9th, 1914. Easter Island. Arrival at the island, March 29th, 1914. Mana leaves May 23rd, 1914. Native rising begins July 1st, 1914. Arrival of Chilean warship, August 4th, 1914. Mana returns August 23rd, 1914. Mana leaves second time September 4th, 1914. Visit from Von Spee's squadron, October 12th to 18, 1914. S.R. goes to Chile, December 5th, 1914. Visit of Prince Eitel Friedrich, December 23rd to 31st, 1914. Return of Mana with S.R., March 15th, 1915. Mana leaves third time, March 17th, 1915. Mana returns May 28th, 1915. Expedition leaves the island August 18th, 1915. Homeward voyage. Pitcairn Island, August 27th to September 1st, 1915. Tahiti, September 16th to October 8th, 1915. Honolulu, November 11th to December 1st, 1915. Mana leaves Honolulu November 28th, arrives at San Francisco December 25th, 1915. Hawaii, December 2nd to 6th, 1915. San Francisco, arrive December 14th, 1915 to January 20th, 1916. K.R. leaves January 16th, reaches England February 6th, 1916. San Francisco left January 20th, 1916. Socorro, February 5th to 6th, 1916. Kibo, March 7th to 9th, 1916. Panama, March 13th to 16th, 1916. Through the Canal, March 17th to 18th, 1916. Cristobal, March 18th to 26th, 1916. Jamaica, April 7th to 9th, 1916. Bermuda, May 2nd to 12th, 1916. Azores, May 31st to June 1st, 1916. Southampton, June 25th, 1916. End of section 30. End of The Mystery of Easter Island, The Story of an Expedition by Katherine Routledge.